Margaret Pole was 65 years old when she was arrested for high treason by Henry VIII. On the 12th of November, 1538, the King's commissioners arrived without warning at Warblington Castle in Hampshire. Margaret was one of the last remaining Plantagenets. Her father was George, the Duke of Clarence, brother to Edward IV and Richard III. Richard was the very man that Henry VIII's father had defeated at the Battle of Bosworth to claim the throne of England. The Plantagenets had been a lingering threat to the Tudor crown. Margaret's brother had been executed by Henry's father in a conveniently discovered plot. But Margaret had been able to navigate through the dangerous early years of the Tudor dynasty. For a time, she was deeply favored by Henry VIII, who restored her title as the Countess of Salisbury, and once reportedly called her the holiest woman in England. She even served as the governess to his eldest daughter, Mary, and became one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in England. But when Henry sought to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and break with the Roman Catholic Church, Margaret's loyalties fractured the king's favor. She remained staunchly devoted to the old faith, to Catherine, and to Princess Mary. When Henry declared that Mary was illegitimate and stripped her of her royal household in 1533, Margaret defiantly refused to surrender Mary's jewels and offered to pay for the princess's servants out of her own pocket. Henry was furious and immediately dismissed her from court. But it was not this that would ultimately shatter Margaret's fragile security. It would be the actions of her son, Reginald. For years, Henry VIII had generously funded Reginald's extensive education in Italy, grooming his brilliant Plantagenet cousin for the highest ranks of the Catholic Church in England. But when Henry broke with the Pope to establish himself as the supreme head of the new Church of England, he demanded that Reginald publicly support the schism and his marriage to Anne Boleyn. Reginald refused. He exploited the distance and safety he had by being far away in Italy and published a scathing and highly personal treatise in 1536 titled Pro Ecclesiasticae Unitatis Defensione, in defense of the unity of the Church. The manuscript was a devastating blow to Henry's ego. In it, Reginald not only vehemently denounced Henry's supremacy, but he also likened the king to a wild beast. He condemned the recent execution of Thomas More and openly called upon the Catholic princes of Europe to rise up and depose the English king. The Pope at the time was Pope Paul III. He recognized the immense political and religious value of Reginald Pole as a weapon against Henry. He quickly elevated Reginald to the position of cardinal in December 1536. The Pope even went a step further, appointing Cardinal Pole as a papal legate and sending him to Flanders to actively encourage an armed Catholic rebellion of 30,000 men, known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, a force that would directly threaten Henry's throne in northern England. Henry was enraged. He demanded Reginald's extradition and even dispatched assassins to the continent to silence him. But Cardinal Pole was well protected and remained entirely out of reach. Henry was so frustrated by his total inability to capture the rogue cardinal that he elicited the help of his ruthless chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. Their attention turned to the hostages they already held, the Pole family in England. Cromwell began building a deadly case, attempting to link the Poles to other aristocratic Catholic sympathizers. He arrested Margaret's eldest son, Henry Pole, Lord Montague, and her youngest son, Geoffrey Pole. Both were thrown in the Tower of London. Geoffrey was terrified and facing the threat of the rack. He eventually began to confess and implicate his own family, sealing their doom, until the king's men finally came to Warblington for the elderly Countess herself. The commissioners arrived in November, and when they did, Margaret had no idea what was going on. When they began their interrogation, they expected the 65-year-old woman to break easily under the terror of the crown. They relentlessly searched her private chambers, her coffers, and her belongings from noon until nightfall. They were desperately trying to find hidden or treasonous correspondence from her son, Cardinal Pole. Yet, Margaret fiercely maintained her absolute innocence. She refused to implicate herself or her family. The commissioners were astounded by her unbreakable resilience. They wrote back to Thomas Cromwell in London admitting defeat. "We have dealed with such an one as men have not dealed with tofore us. We may call her rather a strong and constant man than a woman." They reported that despite using both mild words and harsh threats, she would not utter, but maketh herself clear. Following her initial interrogation, Margaret was stripped of her vast estates. Her servants were dismissed, and she was placed under strict arrest at Cowdray House in Sussex. During this agonizing wait, her eldest son, Lord Montague, was tried and beheaded on Tower Hill. But Margaret's ordeal was far from over. Because she had maintained such a formidable defense during her interrogations, Thomas Cromwell knew a public trial would be disastrous for the crown. They lacked concrete evidence of her treason. So Cromwell bypassed the justice system entirely. In the spring of 1539, he pressed Parliament with a piece of supposed evidence: a white silk tunic embroidered with the 5 wounds of Christ, the symbol of the Catholic pilgrimage of grace, claiming that it had been found in her belongings. Through an act of attainder, Parliament declared Margaret guilty of high treason by royal decree, completely stripping her of any legal right to face her accusers. She was not allowed to hear the evidence against her or to speak in her own defense. She was transferred to the Tower of London. For 2.5 years, Margaret Pole languished as a prisoner. The brutal, damp winters took a severe toll on her aging body. The conditions were so harsh that records show the Crown eventually took pity on her physical decline and provided her with a nightgown furred, a kirtle of worsted, and a petticoat, so she would not freeze to death in her cell. She even outlived her greatest enemy, Thomas Cromwell, who fell from grace and was executed in 1540. But the king's vengeance against the Pole family remained unquenched. On the early morning of May 27, 1541, the constable of the Tower suddenly arrived at her cell. He informed her that she was to die within the hour. Margaret was completely stunned. It was written that she found the sudden sentence very strange. She told the constable that she did not know of what crime she was accused, nor how she had been condemned. The regular master executioner of the Tower was not in London the morning of the execution. He had been sent north to York to carry out the executions of rebels involved in a recent uprising. In his place, the task was left to a completely inexperienced deputy. Because of her royal blood, Henry spared Margaret the public spectacle of being executed on Tower Hill, instead ordering it to take place in a private, enclosed space within the Tower precincts. Only a small, select group of officials, including the Lord Mayor of London and a few aldermen, were present to witness the end of the Plantagenet line. As Margaret was led to the spot, she found no grand, elevated scaffold draped in black velvet. There was only a low wooden block placed upon the ground. A popular, highly dramatized myth invented much later claimed that Margaret boldly refused to kneel, declaring, "So should traitors do, and I am none," and was chased around the scaffold by the headsman. But contemporary Tudor records tell us a far more somber, stationary, and terrifying reality. Margaret obediently knelt, commended her soul to God, and laid her head upon the block. The nervous youth raised the heavy axe, but his aim was horribly off. Instead of striking her neck, the blade missed entirely and crashed deep into Margaret's shoulder. She cried out in agonizing pain. Panic set in. It was written that rather than delivering a swift, composed second blow to end her suffering, the wretched and blundering youth began to strike wildly at the struggling woman upon the ground. The boy literally hacked her head and shoulders to pieces in the most pitiful manner. Some suggest it took as many as 11 blows before the 67-year-old Countess finally succumbed and her head was severed from her body. Her mangled remains were hastily gathered up. Margaret Pole was placed in a grave beneath the stone floor of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower grounds. The last Plantagenet was laid to rest mere feet away from the remains of Anne Boleyn, the very woman whose marriage to Henry VIII had triggered the religious schism that ultimately doomed the Pole family. Margaret was 67 years old when she died.